This chapter focuses on the customizations that we can make to Spring Security's authentication process. We have seen all of the features that come with Spring Security out of the box, and how rapidly we can establish application security. In this chapter, we're going to peel back some of the layers of the onion to really see the internals that provide us with that functionality, and we're going to work to customize them. One of my gripes with a lot of the trainings I've attended or a lot of the reference materials that I have studied is that they provide you with great circumstances. You get this nice application, it teaches you all these basics, and then you go back to your desk. And when you have to move beyond the basics to really conform to the challenges you face in your daily environment, it's sort of lacking what you've been taught. This chapter really provides you with what you need to get your hands dirty with the framework once you enter that work environment and need to apply the authentication principles of Spring Security to your situation. So let's talk a little about what we're trying to achieve in this chapter. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to take a look at how authentication fits into Spring Security. How do we enter the authentication process? And we'll take a look at security interceptors and the role they play within the framework, and how they are able to protect resources and route us into the authentication process. Once we talk about how we get to the point where we perform authentication, we're going to look at some of the main components that allow us to authenticate a user. We have these security interceptors that are high at this global level, and then we have these components that really help us with authentication. And one we're going to look at is the user detail service, and this allows us to retrieve information about a particular principal that we have stored in something like a database. Next, we'll look at the security context holder, and this is a component that allows us to retrieve information about the authenticated user pretty much anywhere within our code. The user details object works closely with the user details service, but basically it is Spring Security's representation of a user within the framework. We'll learn how we can integrate a user details object with a custom user object we may have for our application. We'll also take a look at how we can create new users within an application and how we can authenticate them. And that's very easy when we have implemented the user details interface with our custom user object for our domain. We'll next take a look at authentication providers and how they allow us to configure authentication logic within an application. So once we need to move beyond just checking username and password, we can establish an implementation of an authentication provider, and we can pretty much use all sorts of custom logic to determine whether or not we authenticate a principal. Now, the authentication provider relies upon an authentication object. You'll see that once we enter an authenticate method on the authentication provider, it gets past this authentication object. At that point, the authentication object really represents the user's credentials. So it's that information they are presenting to us. This is who I am, and here's how I validate it. So username and password, something like that. And then the authenticate method on the authentication provider passes back another instance of an authentication object. This instance actually has the authorities that are granted to that principal or that user. By passing back that authentication object, we are saying they have successfully authenticated. So we'll look at that process, and we'll also look at how we can create our own authentication objects and integrate them within Spring Security's authentication process. We're really going to dig into some of the internals within Spring Security, and I always enjoy getting that really down in the weeds look at things.